41 years I was married to that woman. 41 years I handed her every dollar, every deed, every ounce of trust I had. Then, one Sunday, at my own kitchen table with our son sitting right there, she slid a folder across the wood to me and said, "The mill isn't yours anymore, Silas. None of it is. It hasn't been for a long time." I looked at my boy. Josiah was 40 years old, a grown man with sawdust worn permanently into the creases of his hands, and he would not lift his eyes off his coffee. 68 years old I was that morning, and in the space of one sentence, I understood that the two people I loved most in this world had been quietly emptying my life out from under me board by board, year by year. And the worst part, the part that sat in my chest like a swallowed stone, was that I had signed every single paper myself. I did not shout. I have never been a shouting man. I set my mug down and I looked at Rosalind across the table where we had eaten 41 years of breakfasts, and I asked her one question, just one. And the answer she gave me is the reason I am sitting here tonight telling you all of this. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Sunday morning before the folder, before the question, when I still believed I was a fortunate man. The sun came up gray over Potter County that morning, the way it does in late October when the maples have gone to rust, and the mornings smell like wood smoke and wet leaves. I was up before it the way I have been up before the sun for near on 50 years. There is no lie in a man who wakes before the light. That is what my father told me and his father told him, back when the three of us Oberholzers ran the same sawmill on the same bend of the Allegheny that I ran alone now. I made my coffee. I carried it out to the mill in the dark, the gravel crunching under my boots, and I did what I always did on a Sunday when the saws were quiet. I walked the yard. I laid my hand on the logs waiting to be cut. You learn things with your hands that your eyes will lie to you about. I put my palm flat on a black cherry log, cold and damp from the night, and I could feel where it was sound and where it was not. 40 years of this, and I could tell you which board would come out clean and which would split before the blade ever touched it. A tree can stand tall and green for half a century and be rotted hollow at the very center, and no one walking past would ever know. Only the man with his hand on the wood knows. I was proud of that. God help me, I thought it made me careful. That morning the cherry log was sound clear through. I remember thinking it would make good cabinet stock. I remember thinking Josiah could mill it that week. I remember standing in my own yard in the gray light, believing that everything I could touch was exactly what it appeared to be. Then Rosalind called me in for breakfast. Her voice came across the yard, the same as it had for 4 decades. Soft and even carrying just far enough to reach me and no further. Silas. Breakfast. 2 words, and I turned and walked toward the house the way I had walked toward that voice 10,000 times, never once suspecting that a voice could be a thing rotted hollow at the center. While the outside stood tall and green, she had the table set. She always did. Rosalind kept a house the way I kept a shop, everything in its place, nothing wasted. There was a jar of yellow buttercups on the windowsill above the sink, the way there had always been fresh ones cut every few days, no matter the season. I had stopped seeing them years ago the way you stop seeing anything that has simply always been there. Josiah was already at the table. That was the first thing that was wrong, though I did not know to read it yet. My son did not come to Sunday breakfast unless he was asked, and I had not asked him. He sat with both hands around his coffee and his shoulders up around his ears, and he said good morning to me in a voice that did not sound like his own. I sat down. I said something about the cherry log. Josiah nodded and did not answer. And then Rosalind sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and told me the mill was not mine. She did not say it cruelly. I want you to understand that. She said it the way you would tell a man his coffee had gone cold, a small, true fact he simply had not gotten around to noticing. The folder was already there beside her plate. She must have set it out before she called me in. She slid it across the wood, and I opened it, and I saw my own signature on document after document. I did not remember the meaning of deeds and transfers and account numbers, my name in my own hand, dated over 11 years. "It hasn't been yours for a long time," she said again gently. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but it's done now, Silas. It's better if you just understand that it's done." I looked at my son. Josiah looked at the table, and I felt it then, the thing I had spent 40 years feeling for in other men's timber, and never once thought to feel for at my own kitchen table. I put my hand flat on that folder the way I would put it on a log. And I understood cold all the way through that the tree I had trusted my whole life had been hollow at the heart the entire time, and I had never once put my hand where it counted. I did not shout. I set down my mug. I asked her my one question. Her answer is where this story truly begins. Before I give you her answer, you have to understand the man I was, because a man is never robbed all at once. He is robbed the way water takes a riverbank, one grain at a time over years, until the day the whole thing gives way, and he wonders how he never heard it coming. I was born poor in a county that has never known much else. Potter County sits up in the high timber of northern Pennsylvania, and when I was a boy, the whole economy of the place was trees, and the whole future of a boy like me was to cut them for another man's profit. My father ran a small mill and lost it when I was 14, and I watched what it did to him to shake hands with the bank that took it. He did not drink. He did not rage. He just got quieter every year until the quiet was most of what was left of him. I swore I would never sign my name to a debt I could not pay. I swore it the way boys swear things with my whole chest. And unlike most boyhood oaths, I kept this one for 50 years. When I was 26 and wanted to buy back the very mill my father had lost, I did not go to the bank. I went to my brother-in-law, Odell Brummer, who had married my sister and had a little money set by from years of Finnish carpentry, and I asked him for a loan. Odell counted out the cash on his own kitchen table and told me not to thank him, just to do something with it. I did something with it. 14 months later, I set every dollar back on that same table plus 200 more he had not asked for and did not want. And when he tried to push the extra back at me, I walked out to my truck and left it there. You do not build a life on a debt you never repay. That was the whole of my religion, and I practiced it more faithfully than I ever practiced the other kind. That was the wound, though. I would not have called it that. I would have called it principle. I had felt once the shame of a family owing what it could not pay, and I had built my entire self around the promise that no one would ever feel that shame on my account again. Trust and debt got tangled up together in me somewhere along the way. To me, loving someone meant handing them everything and never once asking to see the books. Asking to see the books was what the bank did to my father. I would sooner have cut off my own hand. You can see maybe where a man like that is soft. You can see the exact place to put the blade. By the fall I am telling you about, I was 68, and I owned the mill outright. Or believed I did. 3 generations of Oberholzers on the same bend of the Allegheny. I had a wife who kept a beautiful house, and a son who could read a log almost as well as I could. And I thought I was the rare man who had wanted simple things and gotten them. Odell was the only one who ever tried to tell me otherwise. He was 71 that year, retired, his hands gone to arthritis, and he still came by the mill most Saturdays to sit on an overturned bucket and watch me work and say very little. Odell was a man who watched people the way I watched timber. And one Saturday, the spring before, out of nowhere, he said, "Silas, does it ever strike you how much of the money runs through Rosalind's hands and not yours?" I did not even stop the blade. I said she kept the books because she was better at it than I was, which was true. I said a marriage was not a business, which I believed. And Odell looked at me for a long moment with those watching eyes, and then let it go, because he was my brother-in-law and my oldest friend. And he knew there are things you cannot tell a man about the woman he loves. He knew that if he pushed, I would hear it as an insult to her and to me for choosing her, and that I would defend her harder than I would defend myself. That is the thing about a good defense. It works on the people trying to help you exactly as well as it works on the people trying to hurt you. Better even. Odell only wanted to protect me, and my own certainty shut the door in his face while it held it wide open for everyone else. I want to tell you about one more thing from that spring, because I did not understand it until much later. And when I did understand it, it turned my stomach. A man came to the mill to buy cherry for a set of cabinets, a doctor from Cootersport with more money than sense, and I gave him the tour the way I do. I laid his hand on a log and taught him what my father taught me, how a tree can look flawless bark to crown and still be punky and hollow at the core. How the only way to truly know is to get inside it. The doctor loved that. City people always love that. And right as I was saying the word hollow, right, as I had a stranger's hand pressed to the dead center of a rotten log, Rosalind's voice came across the yard, soft and even calling me in for lunch. I excused myself, and I went. Of course I went. I had been going toward that voice for 40 years. I did not hear it then. I want you to understand how completely I did not hear it. I stood in my own mill with my hand on a hollow tree, telling a stranger that the rot you cannot see is the only rot that can kill you. And my wife called me to the table, and I felt nothing but the ordinary, small gladness of a man whose lunch is ready. The knowing was all around me. It was in my own mouth. And I walked right past it into the house and ate what she had made me and thanked her for it. So when I tell you that on that Sunday in October I was robbed, do not picture a sudden thing. Picture a man who had spent his whole life learning to find the rot in everything he touched, and who had touched this particular tree 10,000 times, and had somehow every single time put his hand exactly where the wood was still sound. Her answer, when she finally gave it, told me why. I will get to her answer. I have carried it long enough that I am in no hurry to set it down. And besides, you cannot understand what one sentence took from me unless you first understand what I thought I had. Rosalind was the most admired woman in our church, and she had earned it honestly, which is what makes the rest of this so hard to hold. For 41 years, she was the wife other men wished aloud that they had. She remembered the names of everyone's grandchildren. She brought food to houses where someone had died before anyone thought to ask. When my own mother went into her long decline, it was Rosalind, not I, who bathed her and turned her and sat up through the bad nights. And when my mother finally passed, she did it holding Rosalind's hand, and not mine. I told myself that was love. Perhaps some of it even was. I have stopped being certain which parts. She kept fresh buttercups on the windowsill above the sink yellow every few days all year round. In winter, she paid a florist 2 towns over to keep them coming. I used to tease her about it, the expense of it, flowers nobody but the 2 of us ever saw. She would say a kitchen needed something alive in it. I thought it was the sweetest kind of vanity, a small, harmless thing a good woman does for herself. I want you to hold on to those flowers. I did not understand them for 41 years, and the day I finally did was one of the worst days of my life. We married young. I was 27, she was 25 older for a bride in those days, and I never once asked her why. A man who has just been chosen by the woman he loves does not interrogate his good fortune. There had been someone before me, I knew that much. A college man from before her family's money went bad. Someone her people had approved of, and then when the money went quietly, stopped approving of. She mentioned him exactly once early on, and then never again, and I took her silence for the ordinary decency of a woman putting the past where it belonged. I was a mill hand with sawdust under his nails, and a half-bought mill to his name. I did not let myself wonder why a woman like that would choose a man like me over a college man. I was afraid of the answer, so I called my fear humility and married her. Her family had money troubles I knew about only an outline, and mine had the mill just barely bought back. And I understood our wedding as two people from hard circumstances deciding to make something solid together. She wore her mother's dress. She cried at the altar. I believed every tear, and I will tell you plainly, I still do not know how many of them were real. That is its own kind of grief, not knowing which of your best memories to keep. The morning I am telling you about, that Sunday in October, was the end of something that had begun 3 weeks earlier with a telephone call. So let me take you there first, because the folder on the kitchen table did not come out of nowhere. Nothing that rots ever does. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I was in the mill when Josiah called me, and I knew before he spoke that something was wrong because my son is a man of few words, and he had started with too many. He was sorry to bother me. He knew I was working. He did not want me to worry. A man only stacks that much padding in front of a thing when the thing is heavy. Then he told me his liver was failing. He said the doctors had a word for it, a long one, and that it had been coming on quiet for a while, the way these things do, no pain, until there was suddenly a great deal of pain. He said he was on a list. He said the list was long and the odds on it were not good, and that a living donor, someone who matched someone willing to give up a piece of themselves, would change everything. He said all of this in the flat, careful voice of a man trying not to ask his father for something. I did not let him finish. I want you to understand that there was no decision in me, no pause, nothing to weigh. He was my son. I had taught him to walk in that mill yard. I had watched him grow from a boy who could barely lift a plank into a man whose hands read timber almost as well as mine. The thought of giving him part of my own body to keep him in the world was not a sacrifice. It was the most natural thing I had ever wanted to do. I told him I would be tested the very next week. I told him to stop talking like a man asking a favor. He went quiet on the line. And then, in a voice I had not heard from my son since he was small, he said, "Okay, Ba, okay." And I sat down on an overturned bucket in my own mill, the same bucket Odell sat on, to watch me work. And I put my head in my sawdust-stained hands, and I thanked a God I had not spoken to sincerely in years that there was something I could do. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. If Josiah had never gotten sick, I would have died an ignorant man. I would have gone to my grave believing I had a faithful wife and a son of my own blood, and a life exactly as sound as it appeared. The illness that nearly took my boy is the same illness that saved me from a lie I would otherwise have loved my whole life. I have never decided whether to be grateful for that. Some mornings I am. Most mornings I only feel the cold place where the certainty used to be. I told Rosalind that evening that I was going to be tested as a donor. I remember she went very still at the stove. Her back was to me and her shoulders came up just slightly, the smallest thing. And if I had spent my life reading people the way I spent it reading wood, I might have understood right then that I had just said something that frightened her more than her own son's dying liver did. But I did not read it. I put my hand on her shoulder and I felt her flinch, and I told myself it was grief. I told myself we were two parents frightened for our child. I went to bed that night beside her the way I had gone to bed beside her for 41 years, and I lay in the dark and prayed that I would be a match. And she lay beside me praying, I now believe that I would not. I did not know yet that a blood test cannot only tell you whether you can save your son, it can also tell you whether he was ever yours to save. The appointment was for the following Thursday. I had no idea I was driving toward the end of my entire life, as I had understood it. The hospital in the city was 2 hours south, and I drove it alone. Rosalind offered to come. She offered the way you offer a thing you are hoping will be declined, and I told her one of us should stay near Josiah, and she agreed a little too quickly, and I thought nothing of it. I thought about my son. I drove through the last of the October color, the ridges going bare and brown, and I rehearsed in my head the thing they had told me on the telephone, that being a match was not guaranteed, even between a parent and a child, that blood was more complicated than love, and that I should prepare myself for the possibility that my body simply would not be the right fit for his. I was not worried. That is the part I can hardly stand to remember now. I sat in that waiting room, certain, absolutely certain that whatever was in my blood would be in his too, because he was mine, because I had made him, because 40 years of watching him grow into my own gestures had convinced me that the boy was cut from my log. I had taught him everything. Surely I had given him this too. Let me tell you about the boy, so you understand what I was sitting there ready to give up half an organ for. Josiah came to the mill before he could properly walk. Rosalind used to bring him out in a basket and set him in the shade of the sorting shed while I worked, and my first clear memory of my son as a person, not an infant, but a person, is of him at maybe 4 years old sitting on the sawdust floor, sorting offcuts by species. Nobody taught him to do it. He just did it, cherry here, maple there, oak in its own pile, his small face very serious. I remember crouching down beside him and asking him how he knew the difference, and he looked at me like it was a strange question and said the cherry smelled like the inside of a drawer. Which it does. It absolutely does, and I had never once thought to put it into words, and my 4-year-old had. He carved the date into the back of everything he made, from the very first crooked little box he built me when he was 9. He said a thing should carry the day it was born. I have that box still. I have every date he ever cut. There is a whole shelf in my house that is nothing but the underside history of my son's hands. And on the drive to that hospital, I was thinking about that shelf and how one day it would be Josiah's mill. And one day his own children might sit in the sawdust, sorting offcuts by smell, and how a man does not get to see much of what he builds. Outlive him, but I was going to see this. I was going to hand it down whole. They took my blood. A young woman with kind hands and a butterfly needle drew 4 vials while I told her about the mill, because I talk when I am nervous. And she smiled and said her grandfather had worked timber up near Cain. And for a few minutes it was a good morning. It was 2 people from timber country passing the time. Then she taped a cotton ball to the inside of my elbow and told me the results would take a few days and that someone would call. I rolled my sleeve back down. I have thought about that 100 times since the ordinary motion of rolling my sleeve back down over the bandage buttoning the cuff. A man who has just done the simplest and most loving thing a father can do, who has offered his own body to keep his child in the world, and who does not yet know that the offer itself is about to become the instrument that takes everything from him. I drove home in a good mood. I stopped and bought a coffee I did not need, just to make the trip feel like an occasion. I called Josiah from a gas station and told him it was done, the first step was done, and I heard him breathe out on the other end like a man setting down something heavy. For 3 days, I felt God forgive me almost happy. There's a particular peace that comes to a man who has found a way to be useful to the person he loves most. My whole life I had shown love by providing, by building, by handing over. Now my own body could provide. I walked the mill yard those 3 days and laid my hands on the logs and felt for the last time in my life like a man whose world was sound. On the second evening, Rosalind made a pot roast, my favorite, the way she did on occasions, and set the table with the good plates, and I remember being touched by it. I remember thinking, look at her. Look at how frightened she is for our boy. Look at how she loves us. She had cut fresh buttercups that afternoon. The jar on the windowsill was full and yellow. I reached over during dinner and put my hand on top of hers and told her it was going to be all right, that I would be a match, that I could feel it. And she turned her hand over under mine and held on, and her eyes went bright, and I have gone back to that moment more times than I can count, trying to understand what she was feeling. I used to think it was hope. Now I think it was the particular terror of a woman who has built a beautiful house on a fault line and has just felt the first tremor come up through the floor. The call came on the 4th day. I was in the mill. My phone rang with the hospital's number, and I answered it with sawdust on my hands and my heart already lifting. Certain they were calling to schedule the surgery, certain the next thing out of the doctor's mouth would be a date. "Mr. Oberholzer," he said, "I need you to come in so we can talk, not over the phone. Can you come in today?" And even then, even with that, I did not understand. I thought perhaps my numbers were off somewhere, my own health, something they had found in my blood that was mine to worry about. I told Rosalind I was driving back to the city. She asked why. I said the doctor wanted to talk in person, and she sat down at the kitchen table slowly, the way you sit when your legs have stopped being reliable, and she said, "Silas." And then she did not say anything else. I should have read it. It was right there on her face, plain as a split running the length of a board. I did not read it. I kissed the top of her head, and I drove back toward the city, toward that small, quiet room, toward the sentence that was waiting there to cut my life clean in two. The room they put me in was small and too warm, with 2 soft chairs and a box of tissues on the low table between them. And I understood the tissues before I understood anything else. You do not set out tissues for good news. Some animal part of me read that box and went still the way the woods go still before weather. The doctor came in and sat down across from me. He was younger than my son, with tired eyes and a folder in his lap, the second folder that season, to carry my whole life inside it. He asked me how the drive down was. I told him it was fine. He looked at the folder, and then he looked at me. And I have been on the receiving end of enough hard news in my life to know the particular silence a man makes when he is deciding how to say a thing that cannot be softened. "Mr. Oberholzer," he said, "the tests came back, and there's no gentle way to tell you this, so I'm going to tell you plainly, because you strike me as a man who'd want it plain." He paused. "You can't donate to Josiah. It isn't a question of 1 marker or 2 being off. Biologically, you are not his father. There's no possibility of a match because there's no relation. I'm sorry. I want to tell you what happened inside me, but the truth is that for a long moment, nothing happened at all. It was like the instant after the blade binds in a log, that half second, where the whole mill goes quiet, and you know the wood has done something wrong, but you have not yet felt it in your arms. I heard the words. I understood each one. And then they simply sat in the room with me, too large to pick up. You are not his father. The doctor was still talking. He was saying kind, careful things, that this happened more than people knew, that it did not change 40 years of raising a son, that Josiah did not need to know any of it. If I chose that, their only concern was finding my boy a donor, and this simply meant it would not be me. He was a good man doing a hard job well. I heard maybe half of it, because here is what was happening under the quiet. It was not the thing you would think. I was not in that first moment grieving the son who was not mine by blood. Josiah was mine blood, or no blood that was never in question and never became one. No. What went through me cold and total was something much worse and much larger. If this was not true, then nothing was. If the boy I had watched come out of my wife was not mine, then the wife was not mine either, had not been. Not in the way I had staked my entire life on. 41 years. The buttercups. The tears at the altar. The hand turned over under mine 2 nights ago at the dinner table. Every soundboard I had ever laid my hand on, and the whole tree hollow at the core the entire time. And I had built 3 generations of my family on top of it. I did not shout. I have told you I am not a shouting man, and I want you to understand that this was not strength. A man does not stay quiet in that room because he is strong. He stays quiet because something in him has understood faster than thought, that if he opens his mouth, even a crack, everything behind it will come out at once and never stop. Silence was not my dignity. It was my tourniquet. The doctor asked if I had any questions. I asked him one thing. I asked if the test could be wrong. He said it could be repeated, but that he had no doubt about the result, that this kind of finding was not ambiguous. I nodded. I thanked him. I actually thanked him. God help me the way my father must have thanked the bank. And then I did the only thing my hands knew how to do with a thing too heavy to hold. He had set a copy of the results on the table for me, a single sheet, and I picked it up and I folded it once, and then I folded it again into a neat, small square, the size of a business card, and I put it in my shirt pocket over my heart, the way I have carried a pencil there my whole working life. Then I stood up and I shook the doctor's hand, and I told him to please, whatever else happened, to keep working on finding Josiah a donor, because the boy was still my son, and none of the rest of it changed that one single thing. And he looked at me with something like respect and something like pity, and he said he would. I do not remember walking out. I remember I was suddenly in the parking lot in the flat, gray afternoon light, standing beside my truck, with my keys in my hand, and no memory of having taken them out of my pocket. I remember the cold coming up off the asphalt. I remember a family walking past me toward the doors, a young couple with a baby, the man carrying the car seat, the careful way you carry a new thing, and I remember thinking, without any bitterness, only a vast and bottomless tiredness, that he had no idea, that none of us ever have any idea. I did not cry in that parking lot. I want to be honest with you about all of it, and the honest thing is that I could not have cried if I had wanted to. What I felt was not the hot thing. It was the cold thing, the thing that comes when a man's entire understanding of his own life quietly changes state. The way water becomes ice without any sound at all, and everything that used to move is suddenly locked and still. I sat there a long time. I could not tell you how long. The light went from gray to grayer, and the cars came and went in the rows around me, people arriving with their own bad news, waiting behind their own too warm doors, and I sat in the middle of all of it like a stump in a cut field. I thought about calling Odell. I got as far as finding his name in my phone. Then I understood that I did not yet have the words, only the cold, and I put the phone face down on the seat beside me, and I thought strangely about my father. About the day the bank took the mill, and how he had come home and sat at the kitchen table without taking off his coat, and how my mother had put a plate in front of him, and he had not touched it, had just sat there looking at a spot on the wall. I had been 14 and furious at him for being so quiet, for taking it. I understood him now. 40 years too late in a hospital parking lot 2 hours from home, I finally understood my father. Some blows do not knock a man down. They just take the ground out from under him so slowly that he keeps standing in the place where the floor used to be. I got in the truck. I did not start it. I took the folded paper out of my shirt pocket, and I unfolded it, and I read it again all the way through, the medical language and the plain conclusion at the bottom. And then I folded it back up along the same creases and put it back over my heart. And it was in that truck, in that parking lot with the engine still cold, that the second thing came to me. Because a man who has spent his life finding rot does not stop at the first soft place he finds. If Rosalind had lied to me about something this large, for this long, this well, then she had not done it alone, and she had not done it for nothing. A lie like that is expensive. Somebody somewhere had been paid. I started the truck. I did not drive home. I drove to the mill in the dark, and I did not turn on the lights. There is a thing men in my trade do not talk about much, which is that a sawmill at night is one of the loneliest places on this earth. In the daytime, it is all noise and purpose, the scream of the blade, the smell of hot resin, the good, clean work of turning a tree into something a family will keep. But at night, with the machines cold and the yard lights off, it is just a big, dark building full of dead trees, and the wind moves through the stacked lumber and makes a sound like the whole place is breathing slow. That is where I went. I did not go home to Rosalind. I could not sit across a table from her that night, could not look at that face, and its 41 years of practiced kindness, could not trust myself to say nothing, and could not afford to say everything. So I drove to the mill, and I let myself in the side door, and I stood in the dark for a while, just breathing with that folded paper still over my heart. And then, because a man has to do something with his hands, or he will do something with his voice, I turned on the light over the main saw, and I picked out a log to cut. It was a black cherry, a good one or so. I had judged it 3 days before, when I was still a man whose judgment I trusted. I had set it aside for cabinet stock, the kind of straight, clean bowl that comes along a few times a year. I rolled it onto the carriage in the dark and empty mill, and I lined it up, and I brought the blade down through it at 3 o'clock in the morning like a man possessed, because I needed, I think, to prove to myself that I could still read one true thing in this world, that my hands still knew something, that everything I had ever believed was not a lie. The blade went in, and about 4 inches deep, right at the heart of that beautiful straight log, it found the hollow, punk, rot, a soft brown cavity running up the center of the trunk that no one could have seen from the outside, that I had laid my own hand on and pronounced sound, that had stood in my yard, looking like the best log of the season with its whole heart eaten away. The blade wandered in the soft wood the way it does, and I shut the mill down and stood there in the sudden quiet, looking at the open face of that log, at the rot at the center of the thing I had been so sure of. And I want to tell you, I have never in my life laughed and wanted to weep at the same moment the way I did standing in front of that cherry log at 3 in the morning. Because there it was. There was the whole of it laid open on the carriage of my own saw. The thing looks perfect. You put your hand on it. You have 40 years of knowing, and the rot is exactly where your hand cannot reach, dead center hollow at the heart. And the only way you will ever find it is to take the whole thing apart. I sat down on Odell's bucket. I put my head in my hands. And for the first time since the doctor's small, warm room, something in me came loose, and I did not weep exactly. I am not sure I know how anymore. But I sat there and shook for a while in the empty mill with the smell of cut rot in the air, and nobody saw it, and that was the only way I could have let it happen at all. When it passed, I was a different man than the one who had walked in. I want to be careful how I say this because it is the closest thing to a turning point this story has. Some men, when the ground opens under them, spend the rest of their lives grieving the ground. I sat on that bucket, and I understood that I had a choice in front of me, and that it was the same choice I had gotten wrong my whole life. Only now I could see it plain. I could do what I had always done. I could put the paper away and never repeat the test and go home and love the beautiful hollow tree and keep my son and keep my wife and keep my peace and let the rot stay in the dark where it had always been, where it was comfortable, where it did not have to be looked at. Nobody would blame me. A great many people would call it wisdom. Let sleeping dogs lie. What good does the truth do a man of 68? I could feel the old pull of it, the deep pull, the same voice that had told me for 40 years that to look too closely at the people you love is a kind of betrayal. Or I could pick up the whole log and take it apart. I sat there until the birds started the first gray of Thursday, coming up through the high windows, the same gray as the parking lot, the same gray as every morning of my life. And somewhere in that long hour, I made the decision that everything else in this story comes from. I decided I would rather know. I had spent my whole life believing that trust meant never asking to see the books, that love meant handing everything over and looking away. And I had just been handed the bill for that belief, 41 years of it all due at once. I was done looking away. Whatever was rotten in my life, I was going to cut it open and see the whole of it, even if it took the whole tree down. I did not know yet how deep the hollow ran. I did not know that the paper in my pocket was only the first soft place, and that if I followed the rot to its source, I would find a name I had never heard, and a reason for the buttercups on my windowsill, and a truth about my marriage that made not being Josiah's father almost the smallest part. I stood up off the bucket. My knees cracked. The mill was full of gray light now. And I went home to my wife, and I made myself smile at her over the breakfast table, and I said, the doctor had told me I was not a match, which was true, and I said nothing else, which was the hardest sentence I have ever not spoken. Then I drove into Cootersport, and I called a man I had trusted for 25 years, and I told him I needed to see everything. Calvin Reese had been my lawyer for 25 years, and my chess opponent for longer than that. He was 63, a careful man, the sort who got quieter when things got serious instead of louder, which is the only kind of lawyer worth having, and the only kind of man worth playing chess against. When I called him that Thursday morning and told him I needed to sit down with him about my own finances, he did not ask a single question over the phone. He just said, "Come to the office at 4." And I heard something shift in his voice because Calvin knew me. And he knew I was not a man who called his lawyer about his own money for no reason. His office was above the hardware store on Main Street in Cootersport, up a narrow flight of stairs, a room that had not changed in 25 years, except to accumulate more books. I sat down across the desk from him, and he poured us both coffee from the pot he always had going, and he waited. That was the thing about Calvin. He would wait all afternoon if he had to. He never once filled a silence he had not made. I did not tell him about the hospital. Not that first day. I was not ready to say those words out loud to another living person, and besides, I did not need to. What I needed was the money. So I told him I wanted a complete accounting of everything Rosalind and I owned, every account, every deed, every asset, going back as far as the records went. I told him I wanted to understand exactly what was in my name and what was not. And I watched him take that in, this strange request from a man who had never in a quarter century shown the slightest interest in the paperwork of his own life. And I watched him decide not to ask why. "Give me a few days," he said. "I'll pull what I can and request the rest. Some of it I'll need your signature to access." He paused. "Silas, is Rosalind all right?" I said she was fine, which God help me she was. She was better than fine. That was rather the whole problem. He called me back 11 days later, and I knew from the first word out of his mouth that he had found the rot. Calvin did not do dramatics. But when a careful man says your name and then stops to choose his next sentence, you learn to hear the stopping. "I need you to come in," he said. "And I need you to come in ready to sit for a while. This is going to take some explaining." I drove into town. I climbed the narrow stairs. And Calvin had covered his desk in paper organized in a way I did not yet understand. Rows of statements and deeds and printouts, and he stood behind it like a doctor about to walk a man through his own bad scan. "I'll start with the simple part," he said. "The mill, the land and the buildings and the equipment. You believe you own it outright, correct, free and clear, 3 generations. I said yes. "You don't," he said. "You haven't for 11 years. In 2014, the mill was transferred into a limited liability company. You're listed as a member, but a minority one. You hold 30%. The controlling interest, 70%, is held by the LLC's managing member." He looked at me. "The paperwork is all signed. Your signature is on the transfer. Do you remember signing it?" I thought about it. And slowly, sickeningly, I did remember. 11 years ago, Rosalind had come to me with a folder of papers one evening and said her cousin, the accountant, had recommended we restructure the business for tax reasons, that it would save us money, that it was all very standard, and I did not need to trouble myself with it. And I had trusted her because she kept the books, because she was better at it than I was, because a marriage was not a business, because to ask to read every page would have been to insult the woman I loved. I had signed where she pointed. I had not read a word. "Who's the managing member?" I asked. But I think some part of me already knew it was not going to be a name I recognized. "That's where it gets complicated," Calvin said. "The managing member isn't a person. It's another entity, a holding company. And here's the part I want you to hear carefully, Silas, because it took me 3 days to trace, and I want to make sure you understand what it means." He pulled a single sheet from the middle of the desk. "Over the past 22 years, money has been leaving your joint accounts. Not large amounts at once. Small transfers, regular ones spread out. The kind that don't trip any alarm. Investment funds. Savings. The proceeds from the good years at the mill. Over 22 years, it adds up to a great deal of money, and nearly all of it has flowed through one intermediary or another into the same holding company that now controls your mill." I sat very still. "How much?" I said. He told me, I will not repeat the number here because it is not the number that matters, but I will tell you that it was the work of a lifetime, my lifetime, 3 generations of Oberholzers on the same bend of the river, and it had been carried out of my house one small, quiet transfer at a time, over 22 years, and I had walked past it every single day, the way I walked past the buttercups on the windowsill. Calvin let the number sit between us for a moment, and then he did something I did not expect. He came around the desk and pulled up a chair beside me so that we were both looking at the same paper, from the same side, the way you sit beside a man rather than across from him when the thing on the table is grief and not business. He walked me through it line by line. Here was the year Josiah started school and a transfer. Here was the year we re-roofed the house and a transfer the same month, so that the money going out looked like the money we were spending. Here was the year of the good walnut harvest, when I had come home proud that we would have something set aside at last, and here that same quarter was the quiet channel that had carried most of it away. She had used my own generosity as cover. Every time I felt I was providing for my family the way a man should, there was a corresponding line pulling it out the back, and the two motions had moved together so smoothly for so long that the books had always balanced to a man who did not read them. "She's good," Calvin said quietly, and there was no admiration in it, only the flat respect one careful man gives another's careful work. "Whoever helped her set this up is better." "The holding company," I said. "Who owns it?" Calvin turned the sheet around so I could read it. And there at the top, listed as sole owner and director of the entity that now held my mill, and most of the money I had made in my life, was a name I had never heard spoken in my house, not once in 41 years. Emmett Frayne. I looked at that name for a long time. It meant nothing to me. It was just 2 words on a page, an ordinary man's name, and yet Calvin was watching me the way you watch a man read his own diagnosis, and I understood that whoever Emmett Frayne was, he was the source. He was the deep place the rot had run to. He was the hollow at the center of the hollow. "I've never heard of him," I said. Calvin nodded slowly. "I was afraid you'd say that," he said. Calvin found Marguerite Sowards through the old firm records, a name buried in the history of our accounts, from years back, before Rosalind had taken the books over herself, back when we still used an outside bookkeeper the way most small operations did. Meg, everyone had called her. She had done our taxes and our payroll for nearly a decade until one year, with no real explanation, Rosalind had let her go and brought the accounting in-house. I remembered it only vaguely, one of 1,000 small domestic decisions I had never questioned, because questioning was not what I did. Calvin reached her by telephone first. She would not talk business on the line. She agreed to meet him, and only him, at a diner 2 towns over from Coudersport, someplace far enough that no one from our circle would walk in and recognize either of them. When Calvin told me this, I understood before he said another word that Meg Sowards knew something, and that she had been carrying it a long time, and that it frightened her enough to still be careful after all these years. I was not at that first meeting. Calvin went alone the way she asked, and he called me that evening from his car in the diner parking lot. And I could hear in his voice that whatever had happened inside had shaken even him. "She's been sitting on documents for 6 years, he said. "Copies. She made them before Rosalind let her go, because even then something about the books didn't sit right with her, and she was afraid of exactly what's happening. That someday someone would need proof and there wouldn't be any left. She kept them in a safe deposit box under her maiden name. She said she's been waiting for someone to ask the right question for 6 years, and she was starting to think no one ever would. I asked him why a woman would carry a risk like that for 6 years for a family she no longer worked for, There was a silence on the line, and then Calvin said quietly, "She said Josiah used to bring her coffee every morning when he was a teenager, helping out around the office in the summers. She said he was the kindest boy she ever met, and that she always felt sick knowing what was being built underneath him and not being able to say a word without proof nobody would believe. I had to pull my truck over when he told me that. I sat on the shoulder of Route 6 with the engine running, and I thought about my son bringing an accountant her coffee 30 years ago. Some small, unremembered kindness becoming the reason a stranger kept a folder of evidence for 6 years against the day it might matter. You do not know, when you are kind, which kindnesses will come back to save you and which will simply vanish into the ordinary run of a life. I have thought about that a great deal since. Meg agreed to meet me directly the following week, on the condition that Calvin came too, and that we met somewhere far from anyone who might know either of our faces. We drove 2 hours to a diner outside a town I had never had reason to visit, and I sat in a booth across from a small, tidy woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain and hands that would not quite stay still on the table. And I understood within 30 seconds that this was a woman doing the bravest thing she had ever done in her life, and doing it because it was right, not because it was safe. She ordered coffee she did not drink. She asked before anything else how Josiah was doing, and there was real warmth in the question, not the polite kind people use to fill a silence. I told her he was sick, that there was a reason I was sitting in this diner at all, and I watched something cross her face that I would later understand was guilt, the particular guilt of a woman who has spent 6 years wondering whether her silence had let harm keep happening to a boy she remembered fondly. She apologized to me then for not coming forward sooner, for telling herself for 6 years that it was not her place, that she had no real proof, that a woman with no proof and only a feeling had no business upending a family. I told her she was here now. It was the only comfort I had to offer, and it was not much, but she nodded like it helped anyway. She had a folder. She slid it across the table to me the same way Rosalind had slid one across our kitchen table 3 weeks before. And I felt the strange symmetry of it, one folder taking my life apart, another handing me the pieces back. "I want to be clear about something before you look at this," Meg said. "I never had proof of everything. I had suspicions for years, the way you do when the numbers move in patterns that don't match the reasons you're given. But 6 years ago I found something I couldn't explain away, and I copied it, and I kept it, because I was afraid, and because I was ashamed of being afraid, and I told myself that someday it might matter to someone." I opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, wire confirmations, and something else, something Calvin had not mentioned on the phone. A handful of handwritten notes in a hand I recognized instantly as Rosalind's brief instructions to the old account's dates and amounts and destinations, written in her own careful cursive, the same hand that had signed the church guest book at every funeral in 3 counties, the same hand that had labeled every jar of preserves in our cellar. This was not a scheme run by an accountant behind my wife's back. This was not something done to her. Every instruction in that folder was written in Rosalind's own hand. "There's one more thing," Meg said, and her voice dropped lower, the way a person's voice drops when they are about to say the part they came to say. "I don't know if it means anything to you, but there was a name that came up more than once in the wire instructions before it was ever routed through the LLC. A personal account early on, years before the business structure existed. The name was Emmett. I remember because your wife referred to him once on the phone, not like a business contact, like someone she'd known a long time, like someone she still thought about. I sat very still in that booth with my coffee going cold in front of me, and I understood that I had come to this diner looking for the source of the money, and I was about to leave it, having found something else entirely, something older and colder than any theft buried under 22 years of buttercups and pot roast, and a hand turned over gently under mine at the dinner table. "How long ago?" I asked. "The name Emmett. How long ago did it come up?" Meg looked at me with something like pity. The particular pity of a person who has already done the arithmetic you are only now beginning. "Before Josiah was born," she said. "Long before. Calvin found him in 4 days. A man who has run a legitimate business under his own name for decades does not leave much of a trail to follow. And Emmett Frayne had run several real estate, mostly commercial leasing, around the mid-state, a career built in plain sight, while the money he took from my family moved through it in the dark. Calvin printed everything he found and laid it on his desk the way he had laid out the accounts, and I stood over it and looked at a photograph of a man my own age, silver-haired, well-dressed, standing at some ribbon-cutting with a mayor I half recognized, smiling the easy smile of a man who has never once had to explain himself to anyone. I did not recognize his face. I want that understood plainly. In 41 years, I had never once seen Emmett Frayne, never shaken his hand, never heard his name spoken at our table. Whatever Rosalind had built with him, she had built it entirely outside the walls of the life she shared with me, and she had built it so completely that I had never even suspected there was a second house standing on the same foundation as my own. Calvin found the rest through public records the way a careful man does. Emmett Frayne, born the same year as Rosalind, 2 counties over. Same university, same years a business degree, while Rosalind had studied literature. There was a yearbook photograph Calvin had tracked down, grainy and gray, and I stood in his office and looked at a young woman I recognized instantly, my wife at 20, standing beside a young man with his arm loose around her shoulders in the easy way of people who do not yet know how temporary anything is. They were not officially a couple in any record Calvin could find, but they did not need to be. I have looked at enough young men standing beside young women to know what I was looking at. Her family had money trouble the year she graduated, Calvin said, reading from another sheet. Her father's business failed. There's a gap in her employment history right after about 8 months before she shows up on payroll records here in Cootersport. He looked up at me. That would put her arrival here right around the time you two met. I remembered that story. She had told it to me herself decades ago, in outline the way you tell a story you have smoothed the edges off through years of retelling. Her family's troubles, a fresh start somewhere quiet. I had never once thought to ask what she was starting fresh from, because I had been too grateful that she had chosen to start it with me. Was there a wedding? I asked. Him and her, before me. Not that I can find, Calvin said. But there's a gap, Silas. 8 months where I can't account for her at all. And then she's here in your town, working at the diner where you two met within a year of Frayne finishing his degree and going straight into commercial real estate, with what looks like family capital he didn't have 4 years earlier. I understood what he was telling me without him having to say the rest of it plainly. Somewhere in those 8 months a decision had been made. A woman with a family sunk in debt, and a man with a business degree and no capital, and a plan between them that a marriage in a small timber town to a hard-working man who owned half a struggling sawmill might solve 2 problems that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival if she was patient and careful, and willing to build something slow. Calvin closed the folder gently, the way you close a book you do not intend to read again. I want to say something, Silas, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it. None of this proves what her intentions were the day she married you. People change their minds. People fall in love with lives they didn't plan on. I've seen it happen. He paused. But 22 years of transfers to the same man says something too. And I'd rather you hear the hard truth from me now than build a hope on a maybe and have it taken from you again later. I told him I understood. I am not certain even now that I did not fully, because there is a particular kind of understanding that only arrives once in your own kitchen, in front of the one piece of evidence a lawyer's records could never have shown me. I drove home that night with all of it beside me like a passenger, and I let myself into my own kitchen, and Rosalind was at the sink, her back to me. And above the sink on the windowsill, in the same jar she had kept filled for 41 years, were the buttercups. I stood in the doorway and looked at them, the way you look at a word you have read 1,000 times, and suddenly for the first time actually see. I did not go looking for the answer that night. I did not need to. Some things a man simply knows the moment he is finally willing to know them, the way I had known the mid-morning of 100 Saturdays what season a log had been cut in, just from the smell of it, without ever once having to ask. I stood in my kitchen doorway, and I understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof that those flowers had never once been for me. That every jar of them, cut fresh every few days for 41 years, in every season, at real expense, had been a private conversation my wife was having with a man who was not in the room, conducted in plain sight at the center of our home. And I had complimented her on her taste 1,000 times without ever asking what the flower meant or to whom. I thought about our wedding. I thought about the tears at the altar. And I understood now, or believed I understood, that a woman can weep at her own wedding, for more reasons than the one everyone assumes, and that grief and gratitude and grief again can look from where a groom is standing exactly like love. Rosalind turned from the sink and saw me standing there. Something crossed her face, quick and gone, the particular flicker of a person checking a room for danger. "You're home early," she said. I didn't hear the truck. I looked at the flowers. I looked at her. And for the first time since the folder on the kitchen table, I understood the shape of the whole thing. Not the details, yet not the mechanism, but the shape, the way you understand the shape of a tree from a single cross-section of its grain. This had never been a marriage that went wrong. This had been a marriage that was never right to begin with, built on a debt she meant to collect on eventually. And I had spent 41 years paying interest on a loan I did not know I had taken. "They're pretty," I said, nodding at the buttercups, and I watched her relax just slightly, believing I meant nothing by it. I meant everything by it. I simply was not ready, not yet, to let her see how much. I did not sleep that night, or the several after it, and a man who does not sleep starts to see things in the dark that daylight would have shown him were nothing. I want to tell you honestly about the week that came next, because it is not a week I am proud of, and because I think you should know that even a man trying his best to be careful can still get the shape of a thing badly wrong. It started with the LLC papers. Calvin had given me copies of everything, and I sat up 2 nights running at my own kitchen table, the same table, reading through documents I did not fully understand, looking for anything that might tell me how much Josiah knew. And on the 3rd page of the operating agreement, tucked into a list of authorized signatories for the business accounts, I found his name, Josiah Oberholzer. Authorized signatory, dated the same year the mill was restructured. My son's own signature on a document that gave someone other than me control over 3 generations of Oberholzer land. I sat with that for a long time. I told myself there could be an innocent explanation that a business needs signatories, that Rosalind could have had him sign 100 routine papers over the years without him understanding what any of them meant, the same way I never understood what I was signing. But the old wound in me, the one that had spent a lifetime believing that love meant never asking questions, had a twin I had never met before that week, and its name was Suspicion. And once it woke up, it did not want to go back to sleep. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters. Part of what frightened me was not really about Josiah at all. It was about myself. I had just spent 41 years failing to see what was directly in front of me, failing so completely that I had congratulated myself on my own good sense the whole time. And a man who has just discovered how thoroughly he can be fooled does not trust his own eyes again easily, not even when he turns them on the son he raised with his own hands. If I could be wrong about Rosalind, I reasoned in the particular twisted logic of a man 3 weeks into a nightmare, then I could be wrong about anyone. Even him. Especially him, perhaps, since he was the one closest to the rot, the one who had grown up inside it, without ever once knowing the walls around him were not what they seemed. I started watching my own son the way I had never once watched him in 40 years. I noticed he had a new truck, nicer than what a head cook at a decent restaurant in Cootersport should reasonably afford, and where before I would have simply been glad for him. Now I found myself doing arithmetic in my head, running numbers I had no right to run. I noticed that when I brought up the mill's finances at dinner, in a general testing sort of way, he changed the subject a beat too quickly, or so it seemed to me, though. I could no longer trust my own reading of anything. The worst of it came on a Tuesday. I drove out to the mill earlier than usual and found Josiah already there, standing in the office, my office, going through the old filing cabinet where I kept records going back decades. He had a folder in his hands. He did not hear me come in, and for 3 or 4 seconds before he turned and saw me in the doorway, I stood there and watched my own son searching through my own files with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. "What are you doing?" I said, and I heard my own voice come out harder than I meant it, harder than I had ever spoken to him in his life. He startled, and the folder slipped and papers scattered across the floor, and for one terrible moment neither of us moved to pick them up. We just stood there looking at each other across a mess of scattered documents, like two men who had each in that instant become strangers to the other. "I was looking for the old equipment warranties," he said. "The planer's been acting up, and I thought there might be paperwork from when we bought it." He crouched down and started gathering the pages, and his hands, I noticed, were not steady. "But what's going on with you? You've been different for weeks, distant." Ma's noticed too. "She keeps asking me if I know what's wrong with you, and I don't know what to tell her, because I don't know either. Ma keeps asking." That single detail, delivered so plainly, so guilelessly, sat in me like a splinter I could not decide whether to trust or fear. Was that the truth, a wife genuinely puzzled by her husband's withdrawal? Or was it a question being asked for a very different reason, a scout being sent out to learn how much I knew? I did not answer him. I helped him gather the last of the papers, and I watched his hands, and I watched his face, and I hated myself for watching, and I could not stop. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked him. I tried to keep my voice even. I do not know that I succeeded. "About the mill? About the business? About anything?" He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, hurt folding quickly into something harder, something almost angry. "What is that supposed to mean?" he said. "It means what it means," I said, and I heard how cold I sounded, and some part of me was standing outside myself, watching a father interrogate his own son in an empty mill office and wanting to stop and unable to stop. "You think I've done something?" Josiah said slowly, working it out as he said it. "You've been acting strange for weeks, and now you're standing in the doorway, looking at me like I'm a stranger, and you're asking if there's something I'm not telling you. Bah. What is going on? I did not answer him. I could not without telling him everything, and I was not ready to hand my son a truth that heavy without being certain, first how deep his own hands were in it. So I told him it was nothing, that I was tired, that Josiah's illness had shaken me more than I let on, and I watched him decide reluctantly to accept a lie from the one man in his life who had never lied to him before. He left the office ahead of me that morning, without his usual goodbye. I stood alone at the filing cabinet afterward and pulled the same folder he had been holding, and I went through it myself, every page, looking for whatever it was he had truly been searching for. And near the bottom, beneath the equipment warranties, exactly where he said they would be, I found something else. A single sheet folded twice, tucked into the back where it did not belong. A document Josiah had signed 11 years ago at 29 years old, granting power of attorney over a portion of his own future inheritance to a legal representative whose name I did not recognize. My son had signed away a piece of his own future, and he did not even remember doing it. I drove to his house that same evening with the folded document in my jacket pocket, and I sat outside in my truck for a long while before I could bring myself to go to the door, because I did not know which was worse: the possibility that my son would explain this document away and be innocent, or the possibility that he would not, and I would lose the last steady thing I had left standing. He answered in his work clothes, tired sawdust still in the creases of his knuckles, same as always. And when he saw my face, he did not ask me in for coffee or small talk. He just stepped back and let me pass, and I understood he had been waiting all week for whatever this was to finally arrive. I put the document on his kitchen table without a word, the same way Rosalind had put one on mine. And I have thought since about how many folders this family has slid across, how many tables, each one a small, quiet detonation dressed up as ordinary paper. Josiah picked it up. He read it. And I watched his face do something I had never once seen it do. Not confusion exactly, something closer to a man trying to remember a dream after he has already woken from it. "I don't," he said, and stopped. He read it again. "Bah, I don't remember signing this." "You did," I said. "It's your signature." "I know it's my signature." His voice had an edge to it now. Not at me, I understood later, but at himself, at the gap opening up in his own memory. "I'm not saying I didn't sign it. I'm saying I don't remember what it was for. 11 years ago, I signed a lot of things. Ma used to bring papers by the office all the time, tax forms, business forms. She'd say, 'Sign here, it's routine. Your father signs the same thing.' I trusted her. She's my mother. Why would I read every line of something my own mother handed me and told me was routine? And there it was, laid bare on his kitchen table, the family inheritance neither of us had ever meant to pass down. I had spent my whole life believing that to ask to see the books was to insult the person who loved you. And here was my son, 30 years younger, saying the same words back to me in a different key, having learned the lesson from watching me live, it never once knowing it was a lesson at all. "What does it even do?" he asked. "The power of attorney. What did I actually sign away?" I told him what Calvin had explained to me that morning on the phone. The legal representative named in the document, cross-referenced now against everything else Calvin had traced, was an associate of Emmett Frain's firm, retained the same year the Mills LLC was formed. The document gave that representative limited authority to act on Josiah's behalf regarding any inheritance or ownership interest tied to the Oberholzer estate, specifically in matters where Josiah himself was unavailable or unresponsive to communication. In plain terms, It meant that if Josiah ever grew suspicious, ever asked hard questions, ever tried to intervene, there was a legal mechanism already in place to act around him rather than through him. He had not been given a role in the theft. He had been given a lock quietly installed on his own voice years before anyone expected he would ever try to use it. Josiah set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter. "She used me," he said, and his voice had gone flat, the particular flatness of a man arriving at a sentence he cannot yet fully feel the weight of. "Not with me. Around me. She used my own signature to make sure that if I ever figured any of this out, I'd already be locked out of stopping it." I sat down across from him in the chair. I imagine he usually sat in alone, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. I want you to understand what shifted in that silence, because it is the truest thing in this whole story. I had walked into his house that evening, half believing in the small, ugly corner of myself that fear had built that I might find my own son standing on the other side of the wall from me. And instead, I found him standing exactly where I stood, robbed by the same hand blind. For the same reason, having failed to protect himself in the precise way I had failed to protect myself, because he had learned trust from a father who taught it as a virtue and never once mentioned it could also be a wound. "I keep thinking about the birthday card," Josiah said quietly after a while. 2 years ago. Ma gave me a card, said sign here too. It's for the trust update. Your father already signed his copy. I didn't even open the envelope all the way. I just signed where the tab was and handed it back and went back to whatever I was doing. He looked up at me, and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger now. "How many times did I do that, Ba? How many times did I just sign where she told me to sign? Because she was my mother, and I loved her. And it never occurred to me that loving her and questioning her couldn't both be true at the same time." I did not have an answer for him. I had spent 41 years asking myself the same question in a different shape, and I had only found my own answer 3 weeks ago, standing in a hospital parking lot with a folded piece of paper over my heart. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told him, and I meant it more completely than I have meant almost anything in my life. "You trusted your mother. That is not a crime. That is what a son is supposed to be able to do." "Then why do I feel like I helped her?" he said. I did not have an answer for that either, but I reached across his kitchen table and put my hand over his, the same gesture Rosalind had made toward me at our own table not so many weeks before, and for the first time since the doctor's small, warm room, I felt something in my chest that was not entirely cold. "We're going to fix this," I said. "Both of us. Together." Josiah nodded slowly, and then he said the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. "I want to see all of it," he said. "Whatever you know. Whatever Calvin's found. I don't want to be protected from this anymore, Ba. I want to see it all the way through, even the parts about her that are going to hurt." I looked at my son across that table, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I did not see a stranger or a suspect or a boy I had failed to protect. I saw a man deciding in real time to stop being someone things happened to. We met at Calvin's office 3 days later, the three of us on a Saturday, when Main Street was quiet and no one would think anything of my truck parked outside the hardware store. Calvin had cleared his big table and laid the whole thing out in order, start to finish, 22 years of it, the way a man lays out the pieces of an engine he has taken apart, so that another man can finally see how the thing was built. Josiah did not sit down at first. He stood over that table with his hands flat on the edge of it, and he read. He read the way he sorts lumber, slow and total, missing nothing. And I watched my son take in the whole architecture of his mother's work over the better part of 2 hours, and I watched something in him harden into a shape I had never seen before. Not bitterness exactly, but resolve, the particular resolve of a man who has decided to stop being lied to and does not intend to go back. He asked good questions. Better than mine had been, if I am honest. Where I had come to Calvin wounded and blind, needing everything explained twice, Josiah came at it like a problem to be solved, tracing the flow of the money with his finger across the printouts, asking about dates, asking about the LLC structure, asking Calvin what could be undone and what could not. Calvin answered him plainly, the way he answers a man he has taken the measure of and found solid. I mostly watched. That was new for me too, sitting quiet while another man carried the weight of a thing, because my whole life I had been the one who carried, the one who provided, the one who fixed. But I was tired in a way that went past my body, and there was something in watching my son take hold of this that eased a knot in me I had not known was there. He noticed things I had missed entirely. He caught a date that did not line up, a transfer marked as a business expense in a month. The mill had been shut down for repairs, and he circled it in pencil and made Calvin write it down. He asked whether Meg would be willing to testify, and when Calvin said he believed she would, Josiah said quietly that he wanted to thank her himself, that a woman who kept faith with a boy who brought her coffee 30 years ago deserved to be thanked to her face. I looked at my son saying that, and I thought, whatever else that woman took from me, she did not manage to take this. She raised a good man in spite of herself, or perhaps I did, or perhaps he simply became one on his own, the way a straight tree grows straight no matter whose land it stands on. The lone characterization is the key, Calvin said at one point, and I saw Josiah lean in. Most of what left this family went out disguised as gifts, or as legitimate business restructuring, or as investments Rosalind was authorized to make. On paper, a great deal of it looks legal, or at least defensible. That's the trouble with a scheme this patient. It doesn't look like theft. It looks like a marriage where one person handled the money. He tapped the table. But there are cracks. Frayn's holding company received funds that were never disclosed, as gifts never ran through any legitimate business purpose, and can't be explained except as a transfer of your family's assets to a third party with no relationship to the business. That's the thread. If we pull it right, the whole gift characterization starts to come apart, and once it does, the rest follows. Josiah nodded slowly, and then he did the thing I had been dreading since the moment he said he wanted to see all of it. He looked up from the papers and he looked at me and he said, "Bah, there's something you're not telling me. It's been in your face this whole time every time Calvin mentions the medical records. What is it?" I had known this moment was coming. I had not known it would come from him, that my son would be the one to reach into the last locked room and open the door I had not been able to open myself. Calvin went very still across the table. He knew. Of course he knew. He had seen the donor test results weeks ago. He had simply been waiting, the careful man, for me to decide when. I want to tell you that I found some wise and gentle way to tell my son that the man he had called Ba for 40 years was not his father by blood. I did not. There is no gentle way, and I was too tired to pretend there was. So I took the folded paper out of my shirt pocket, the same paper I had carried over my heart for 3 weeks, worn soft at the creases now from folding and unfolding, and I set it on the table in front of him. "I went to be tested," I said, "to give you part of my liver, and the test came back and told me I can't." Because I'm not. My voice did something I did not give it permission to do. Biologically, Josiah, I'm not your father. I never was. She never told either of us. He unfolded the paper. He read it. And the room was so quiet I could hear the clock Calvin kept on the shelf, the same clock that had ticked through 25 years of my divorces and disputes and bad news, marking off the seconds while my son learned the last and worst thing his mother had kept from us both. When Josiah looked up, his eyes were wet, but his voice when it came was steady as a plumb line. You rolled up your sleeve to give me part of your body, he said. Before you knew, you didn't hesitate. You told me to stop talking like a man asking a favor. I could not speak. I nodded. Then I don't care what that paper says. He folded it back along its worn creases slowly, deliberately, and he handed it back to me across the table. And I understood that he was handing me back more than a piece of paper. A father is the man who rolls up his sleeve. Blood is what she used to trick us both. It is not what makes you mine. He set his jaw. And I'm not going to let the thing she used to hurt us be the thing that decides who my father is. She doesn't get that. She doesn't get to take that too. Calvin looked down at the table, giving us the small privacy of his lowered eyes. And I sat in that office above the hardware store, 68 years old, and I understood that I had spent 3 weeks believing the blood test had taken my son from me, when in fact, it had just handed him to me a second time chosen now instead of given, and the choosing was somehow larger than the blood had ever been. Josiah turned back to the papers. His hands were steady now. All right, he said. Tell me exactly what we have to do to take it all back. And tell me what it does to her when we do. Over the next 2 weeks, Calvin built the case the way I build a set of stairs, one careful joint at a time, nothing rushed, nothing left to chance. He filed the request to recharacterize the disputed transfers. He secured Meg's documents through proper channels so that no one could ever say they had been mishandled. He drew up a demand regarding the mill's ownership structure and the power of attorney taken over Josiah's interest. He did it all quietly, methodically, the way a careful man dismantles something that a patient woman spent 22 years building, and he told me more than once that patience on our side would matter more than anything, because the moment the other side understood what was happening, they would move. He was right. They moved on a Thursday. I was in the mill milling the good cherry Josiah had set aside when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, a mid-state area code. I almost let it go. Something made me answer. Mr. Oberholzer. A voice said, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man used to closing rooms. My name is Emmett Frayne. I think it's time you and I had a conversation before this goes somewhere that helps no one. I set down the board I was holding. I had spent weeks learning this man's name, tracing his companies, studying his face in a grainy photograph. And here he was in my ear, sounding for all the world like an old friend, calling to smooth over a misunderstanding. I did not say anything. I have learned late in life the particular power of the silence. Calvin taught me the way a man who does not rush to fill a quiet forces the other man to spend his own words. I understand you've been talking to lawyers, Frayne went on when it became clear I would not. I understand there's some concern about how certain family finances were structured. I want you to know I take that seriously, and I'd like to resolve it in a way that's comfortable for everyone. Discreet, quiet, no courtrooms, no public filings, nothing your community ever needs to hear about. A pause. I'm prepared to be generous, Silas. I can return a significant portion of what you feel is owed. We can sign something that puts this behind us, and you can go back to your mill and your son and your life with your dignity intact. Nobody has to know any of it. That's worth a great deal to a man in a small town, I'd think. Your good name, and there it was. The offer. Delivered exactly the way I now understood everything in my life had been delivered to me, wrapped in reasonableness, in comfort, in the promise that I need not look too closely, that I could sign here and make the trouble go away, and never have to see the rot laid open on the carriage. For a moment, I will be honest with you, I felt the old pull. My good name, my dignity intact. My community never knowing that Silas Oberholzer, who read every log in 3 counties, had been hollowed out at his own kitchen table for 22 years. There was a version of this, where I took his money and his silence, and I buried the whole thing, and no one ever knew what a fool I had been. It would have been the easiest thing in the world. It would have been exactly what I had done my whole life. Mr. Frayne, I said, can I ask you something? Of course. The buttercups. I heard him go still on the other end. My wife has kept the yellow buttercups on the kitchen windowsill for 41 years. Fresh ones. Every few days. In every season, no matter the cost. I never understood it. I complimented her on it for 41 years. I let that sit. Those were from you, weren't they? That was the 2 of you carrying on a conversation in my own kitchen in plain sight every single day of my marriage. The silence on the line told me everything. He was a smooth man, Emmett Frayne, a man who had talked his way out of 100 hard rooms. But he had no answer ready for that, because it was not a question about money, and money was the only language he had ever expected to need with me. Silas, he said finally, and his voice had lost a little of its polish. That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with the practical matter in front of us. Let's be reasonable men and settle the practical matter. Well, here's my answer to your offer, I said. No, not the money, not the silence, not any of it. I spent my whole life keeping quiet, Mr. Frayne, signing where I was told, not asking to see the books, and it cost me everything one small, quiet transfer at a time, because I was too proud to look like a man who checks. I am done being quiet. Whatever this costs me now, I would rather stand in a courtroom in front of my whole community as a man who finally looked than sit in my kitchen one more day as a man who never did. I hung up before he could answer. My hands were shaking, but not the way they had shaken in the mill at 3 in the morning. This was something else. This was the particular tremor of a man who has just for the first time in his life refused the comfortable lie to its face. I called Calvin immediately and told him everything Frayne had said. Calvin was quiet for a moment, and then he said in the flat, satisfied tone of a man watching a plan come together, "He called you directly. Silas, do you understand what that means?" He's frightened. A man like Frayne does not pick up the phone himself unless his lawyers have told him the paper is bad and getting worse. He wouldn't try to buy your silence if your silence weren't suddenly worth buying. A pause. We have him. We just have to hold our nerve and let the filings do the work. He told me to write down everything Frayne had said while it was fresh. The offer, the exact words, the mention of returning funds. Because a man offering to give back a significant portion of what you feel is owed has come very close to admitting that something is owed. I sat down that night and wrote it all out longhand at the kitchen table. And it was strange writing down the words of my wife's other man at the table where I had eaten breakfast beside her for 41 years. With her moving around the kitchen behind me, asking if I wanted more coffee, none of it visible on my face. I had become in the space of a month a man capable of sitting across from the person who had betrayed him and giving nothing away. I did not like what that said about me, but I understood finally that she had been that person the entire time, and that the only difference between us was that I had just learned how, and she had been doing it since before our son was born. That evening I drove home and Rosalind had dinner waiting, and the buttercups were fresh in the jar on the windowsill, bright and yellow in the last of the light. I looked at them, and for the first time I did not look away, because I knew now that the reckoning was coming, and I knew it would happen at that same kitchen table where all of this had begun. And I knew that when it did, I would finally ask her the one question I had been carrying since the morning she slid that first folder across the wood. We did it on a Sunday at the kitchen table because that was where she had started it, and I wanted it to end in the same place. Calvin advised against the kitchen. He said a lawyer's office was cleaner, more controlled, that emotion had less room to move in a room full of filing cabinets. I told him no. 41 years of breakfasts. If the marriage was going to be laid open, it would be laid open on the table where it had been lived. I brought something with me to that table. I want to tell you about it, because it mattered to me even though it mattered to no one else. Out in the mill, I had kept the cross-section. I had cut from that black cherry log at 3 in the morning, weeks before the beautiful straight bowl with the hollow running dead through its heart. I had sanded one face of it smooth, and that Sunday morning I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table beside me. A slab of wood the size of a dinner plate sound, and gold at the edges and rotted black at the center, and I did not explain it to anyone. Rosalind looked at it once and did not ask. Perhaps she understood. I have never known how much she understood. Calvin arrived first in his dark suit, with the slim leather case he had carried for 25 years. Then Josiah, who sat down beside me and put his own hands flat on the table, steady, now a man who had decided where he stood. Rosalind made coffee. She actually made coffee for the lawyer who had come to take her life apart, and the son she had used as a lock, and the husband she had hollowed out, and she set the cups down with the same grace she had brought to every act of service in 41 years. And I understood that I was watching a master of a craft I had never once suspected her of practicing. Then she sat down across from me, folded her hands, and waited, composed, unhurried. "The most admired woman in our church," Calvin began. He did not raise his voice, he never does. He simply laid it out piece by piece the way he had laid it out for me above the hardware store. The LLC. The 22 years of transfers. Emmett Frayne. Meg's documents in Rosalind's own hand. The power of attorney taken over Josiah's future. He set each piece down on the table between them, and Rosalind looked at each one, and her face did not change. That was the thing none of us had fully prepared for. I had braced for tears, for denial, for a scene. What I had not braced for was her stillness. She let Calvin finish the entire account, every last piece of it, and when he was done, she folded her hands a little tighter and said in a voice as even as the one that had called me to breakfast 10,000 times, "You've been very thorough, Rosalind," Calvin said. "Do you want to respond to any of it?" "I don't think I need to," she said. "You seem to have already decided what all of it means." And that was her whole defense. Not a denial, not an explanation. She did not say she was innocent, and she did not say she was sorry, because to say either would have been to concede that she owed us any account of herself at all, and she had decided somewhere long ago that she did not. I sat there and watched my wife of 41 years decline to explain herself the way you might decline a second cup of coffee. And I understood that this composure was not a mask she was holding up under strain. This was simply who she was underneath the wife she had performed. The performance had cracked, and there was no frightened woman behind it, no guilty one, no one begging to be understood. There was just this flat, still, unbreakable certainty that she had been owed a better life than the one she was born to, and had simply taken it, and owed no one an apology for the taking. I put my hand on the cross-section of cherry beside me, on the rot at the center of it. I do not know why. I did not plan to. My hand just went to it the way my hand has gone to wood my whole life when I needed to know something true. And I held it there on the hollow, and I did not say a word. Because here is what was happening in me, and it is the closest I came in this whole business to breaking. It was not anger. I kept waiting for the anger, and it did not come. What came instead, sitting at that table with my hand on a rotted log and my son steady beside me, and my wife declining to explain the theft of my entire life, was grief so total it had no edges. Not grief for the money. Not even in that moment, grief for the marriage. Grief for the simple animal fact that I had loved this person with everything I had for 41 years. And she had felt, apparently, nothing back that she could not set down as easily as a coffee cup, and there was no bottom to that, no floor, just a hollow running dead through the center of the best thing I thought I had ever built. I did not weep. My hand stayed on the wood. And in that silence, the longest of my life, I understood that no courtroom and no filing and no return dollar was ever going to give me back the one thing I had actually lost, which was not the mill and not the money, but the 41 years themselves real to me, and apparently theater to her and gone now either way. Josiah's hand closed over my other hand on the table. He had seen where I was. He held on. It was Rosalind who broke the silence. She looked at me, only at me, as though Calvin and Josiah had left the room, and something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but narrowed, focused the look of a person deciding to play the one card she had left. "Silas," she said quietly, "let me speak with you alone. Just the two of us. 5 minutes. Everything these men are saying, there are things about it. You don't understand things that aren't in any of their papers. You owe me 5 minutes after 41 years. Just you and me. The way it always was." Calvin's jaw tightened. Josiah started to say something. I lifted my hand off the cherry log and both of them went quiet. Because there was, in fact, one thing I still wanted from her. Not an explanation. Not an apology. One question carried since the morning she slid that first folder across this same table, and I understood that she had just, without knowing it, offered me the only room in which I would ever get it answered. 5 minutes, I said, and I stood up. We went out to the back porch, the two of us, where we had sat on 1,000 summer evenings, and she pulled the door most of the way closed behind us, so the others could not hear. The October air was sharp. Somewhere across the yard, the mill stood dark and closed, 3 generations of it, and I thought how strange it was to be having the most important conversation of my marriage in its final minutes. She did not waste them. Whatever else Rosalind was, she was never a woman who wasted anything. "You can stop this," she said low and quick, the composure of the kitchen table gone now that there was no audience to keep it for. "Right now. You can walk back in there and tell Calvin you've decided to settle privately. Emmett will return most of it. You keep the mill, you keep your name. Josiah never has to stand up in any courtroom and have his mother's name dragged through it. Think about him, Silas. Think about what a public case does to that boy. His mother, a thief. His father, a cuckold, all of it in the county paper. Is that the inheritance you want to leave him? You've spent your whole life protecting this family. Protect it now. Let it go quiet. And I will tell you she was good. Even then, cornered, she found the exact soft place and pressed. Josiah, my whole life spent protecting. Let it go quiet. It was the same offer Frayne had made me on the telephone, but sharpened, aimed, delivered by the one person who knew precisely where my old wounds were, because she had spent 41 years mapping them. For a moment the old pull came up in me one last time, strong, the deep, lifelong pull toward the quiet, toward the unopened folder, toward the beautiful log left uncut. Let it go quiet. What good does the truth do a man of 68? Then I asked her my question, the one I had carried since the morning she slid the first folder across the table. I did not raise my voice. I had waited 41 years and 3 weeks for this, and I found when it came that I did not need to. Rosalind, I said, in 41 years, at any point, did you ever love me? Even a little. Even for a while. I am not asking to change anything. I know what you did, and I know what happens now. I am only asking because I have to know which of it was real, so I know which of it to grieve. She went quiet, and I watched her decide whether to lie one last time, the easy, comfortable lie that would have cost her nothing and might even have softened the thing between us. I watched her weigh it. And then because she was cornered and tired, and perhaps because after 41 years she owed me at least the truth, in the one place it could no longer help her, she told it. No, she said. Simply, not cruelly. Just a fact, the way she had told me the mill was not mine. I was fond of you, Silas. That was real, the fondness. You were kind, and you were steady, and you were easy to be fond of. But no, not the way you mean. I loved Emmett before I ever met you, and I loved him the whole time, and I love him still. You were the life I could build while I waited. I'm sorry. You asked for the truth. That's the truth. I stood on my own back porch, and I received the answer I had driven 2 hours and lost 40 years to hear. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect, was that it did not break me. It set me free. Because a man can grieve a thing he understands far better than he can grieve a thing he keeps hoping was different than it was. She handed me the shape of the whole tree in one word, and I finally knew all the way down which parts had been sound and which had been hollow. And there is a terrible clean relief in finally knowing. I thought standing there about all the times I had put my hand on a log and known it was hollow, and cut it anyway because a hollow tree is not worthless. It just is not what you thought it was, and a good miller works with what the wood actually is, instead of what he wanted it to be. 41 years I had milled this marriage as though it were sound cherry. It was not. It never had been. And the grief was not that I had to stop loving her, because you cannot stop a thing that quickly. The love does not know yet that it is over. The grief was that I finally had to love her for what she was, which was a hollow thing wearing the shape of a sound one, and to stop at last pretending my hand had ever told me otherwise. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. That's all I needed. I turned to go back inside, and Josiah was standing in the doorway. He had heard it. All of it. He stood there with his hand on the frame and his face very still, and I understood that my son had just heard his mother say in her own voice that the man who raised him was a life she built while she waited for another one. And I braced for what that would do to him. But Josiah did not look at her the way I feared he would. He looked at me, and then he stepped out onto the porch past his mother as though she were furniture, and he stood beside me and he said to me, not to her, I heard enough. I'm not settling anything quietly. I want it on the record. All of it. The money, the mill, the power of attorney, the paternity, everything. Not to hurt her. To make it true out loud, so nobody can ever make it a lie again. He turned to Rosalind then, and his voice did not shake. You used my signature to lock me out of my own life. You used the fact that I loved you. I'm going to spend a long time understanding that. But you don't get to decide one more time what happens quietly. That's done. Rosalind looked at her son, and for the first and only time that day, something crossed her face that might have been real. Not guilt. I still do not think it was guilt. But something. The dawning understanding, perhaps, of what her patience had actually cost, laid out in the face of the one person she might have loved a little after all. Josiah, she said. No, he said. Quiet. Final. The way a door sounds when the latch catches all the way. And the three of us walked back into the kitchen, where Calvin was waiting with his slim leather case, and I sat back down at the table beside the cross-section of cherry sound at the edges and hollow at the heart, and I told my lawyer to file all of it. What happened after is the part people always want to hear, and it is the part I have the least interest in telling, because it turned out that the reckoning I had dreaded and half wanted was not in the end the thing that mattered. But you have come this far with me, so I will tell it plainly. Calvin filed everything on a Tuesday. Once it was on the record, the whole careful structure Rosalind and Emmett had spent 22 years building began to come apart at exactly the speed Calvin had promised, which is to say slowly, then all at once, the way a hollow tree stands for 50 years and then falls in an afternoon. The gift characterization was the first thing to go. Emmett's holding company had received a great deal of money that was recorded on paper as gifts from our family, and gifts under the law ask no questions and expect no return. But Calvin had the wire instructions in Rosalind's own hand, and he had Meg's testimony, and he had the recording in my own notes of Emmett Frayne offering on the telephone to return a significant portion of what I felt was owed, which is not a thing a man says about a gift. A gift is not owed. Emmett had, in trying to buy my silence quietly, confirmed that the money had never been a gift at all. Calvin said it was the single most useful sentence anyone connected to the scheme had ever spoken, and that Frayne had handed it to us for free, because men like him cannot imagine a man like me refusing an easy way out. Once the gifts came apart, the rest followed. The transfers were re-examined as what they were: the movement of one family's assets to an unrelated third party without consideration. The LLC that held the mill was challenged on the grounds that my 30% minority stake had been obtained through a restructuring I had not knowingly consented to, signed under a representation that it was a routine tax matter. The power of attorney over Josiah's interest, taken by an associate of Frayne's firm, collapsed almost immediately once Josiah testified on the record exactly how his signature had been obtained. I will not pretend it was quick or clean. These things never are. It took the better part of a year, and lawyers and depositions and days I do not care to remember. But when it was finished, the mill was mine again, wholly mine, 30% restored, to 103 generations, back where they belonged. A substantial portion of the money was recovered from Frayne's companies, and what could not be recovered was, Calvin told me, the tuition on an education I had paid for over 41 years, and finally at 68 actually received. Emmett Frayne withdrew from every entity connected to us within 60 days on the advice of lawyers who could read the paper, as well as Calvin could. He did not fight. Men like Emmett do not fight losing battles in public, because the fighting itself is the exposure they most fear. He simply receded back into his commercial leasing and his ribbon cuttings, and his silver-haired smile poorer than he had been, and I suspect entirely unchanged. I have not thought about him much. He was never the rot. He was only the place the rot ran to. Rosalind lost everything the scheme had been built to secure. The inheritance she had spent 2 decades quietly diverting the ownership she had structured into her own control, the future she had been building for herself and Emmett, out of my family's work. All of it came apart in the daylight piece by piece on the public record, exactly as Josiah had demanded. Under the law, a spouse who has committed this kind of sustained fraud against the marital estate does not walk away with half of it, and she did not. She left the marriage with what the court determined she was entitled to after everything she had taken was accounted for, which was very little. And she left it as what she had always underneath been a woman alone with a man who had loved her before I ever met her, and would, I assume, love her after. I did not gloat. I want you to know that. There was no moment where I stood over the wreckage of her plans and felt the hot, clean satisfaction that the word revenge is supposed to promise. When the final judgment came, I was in the mill and Calvin called me, and I set down the phone and I stood for a while in the sawdust and the late light, and what I felt was not triumph. It was the particular hollow quiet that comes after a tree you have been cutting all day finally goes down, and the saw stops, and you are left standing in the sudden silence with the thing done and no undoing it. Odell came by the mill the week the judgment was final. He sat down on his overturned bucket the way he had for 40 years, and for a while he did not say anything, because Odell never filled a silence he had not made. Either he and Calvin were alike in that. Then he said quietly, "I tried to tell you, Silas, years ago. I've thought about it a lot, whether I should have pushed harder. And I told him the truth, which was that it would not have mattered, that there had been no version of me back then that could have heard it, that the man he had tried to warn had built his whole self around not being warnable." Odell nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "you heard it eventually." And that was all. It was the closest either of us ever came to speaking of it, and it was enough. Some debts between old men are paid in a single sentence, and a long shared quiet. Because here is what no one tells you about this kind of justice. It does not give you back what was taken. It cannot. The mill was mine again, but the 41 years were still gone. The money came home, but the marriage had never once been real, and no judgment in any courtroom could reach back and make it real, or make it never have happened, or return to me the man I had been on the morning I walked out to lay my hand on a black cherry log and believed, God help me, that everything I could touch was exactly what it appeared to be. They ask me sometimes whether it was worth it, whether I would do it again, open the folder, cut the log, refuse the quiet, knowing what it would cost. And I tell them the truth, which is that I do not know. What I do know is that I could not have done otherwise, not once I had decided to stop being a man who looks away. Some things you do not do because they are worth it. You do them because you have finally become the kind of man who cannot not do them. I drove home that evening to a house with no buttercups in the window. Rosalind was gone by then, and I stood in my own kitchen in the quiet, and I looked at the empty windowsill for a long time. It has been a little over a year now since the morning she slid that folder across the table, and I want to tell you what a life looks like on the other side of a thing like this, because the stories people tell about betrayal usually end at the courtroom, and the truth is that the courtroom is not the end. It is barely the middle. The end, if there is one, happens much more quietly over a long time in a mill in the early morning with your son. Josiah got his liver. I want to say that first, because for all the rest of it, that was the thing that actually mattered, and I nearly lost sight of it in the middle of everything else. A donor was found through the registry, a young man 2 counties over who died in a way his family chose to make meaningful, and the surgery went well, and my son is alive and healing and back in the mill most days now, slower than he was, but here. I did not give him part of my body. In the end, I gave him something I did not know I had to give, which was the sight of his father refusing to look away from a hard thing. And he tells me sometimes that it changed how he intends to live the rest of his own life. I do not know if a man can leave his son a better inheritance than that. I used to think the inheritance was the mill. I have revised my thinking on a great many subjects this year. We work together now in a way we never quite did before. There is no wall between us anymore. The particular wall that a family secret builds without anyone choosing to build it. And I did not even know the wall was there until it was gone. He asks me things now. He asks to see the books. And I show him gladly every page because I have learned at 68 the thing it took me 41 years and a ruined marriage to learn, which is that a man asking to see the books is not a man who distrusts you. He is a man who intends to stand beside you long enough that he had better understand what he is standing on. We put it in writing, too, all of it. The ownership, the succession, the plain arithmetic of who gets what and when. Calvin drew it up. Josiah read every line and asked about the ones he did not understand, and I sat beside him and answered. And I will tell you that signing those papers, with my son reading over my shoulder, was the least lonely I have felt in a signing room in my entire life. That is what it is supposed to feel like. I did not know that until this year. That is the thing I got wrong my whole life, and I want to say it plainly, because if this story is worth anything, it is worth this one sentence. I believed that to love someone was to hand them everything and never ask to look. I believed that asking to see was the same as accusing. I built my entire self around that belief, and I called it trust, and I called it loyalty, and I called it the mark of an honorable man. And it was none of those things. It was fear wearing the clothes of virtue. I was afraid that if I looked too closely at the people I loved, I might find something I could not live with. And so I chose for 41 years not to look, and I called my not looking love. It was not love. Love looks. Love can bear to look, because love is not so fragile that a hard truth destroys it. The thing that cannot bear to be looked at was never the marriage. It was my own fear. And a hollow tree does not become sound because you refuse to lay your hand on the rot. It just falls later and takes more down with it when it goes. I kept the cross-section of cherry. It sits on the shelf in my house now, beside the crooked little box my son built me when he was 9, beside every date his hands ever carved into the back of a thing he made. Sound at the edges, gold and clean and black and hollow at the very heart, and I keep it where I will see it every day, not as a wound, but as a reminder. My whole life I was proud that I could lay my hand on a log and find the rot. It was the truest skill I had, and I never once turned it on, the thing that mattered most, because I had decided in advance that the thing that mattered most was exempt from looking. I will not make that mistake again. There is not enough life left in me to make it twice. Some mornings are still hard. I will not lie to you about that, because I have not lied to you about any of the rest of it. There are mornings I wake before the sun the way I always have, and for 1/2 second in the gray I forget, and I reach across the bed. And then I remember, and the bed is cold on the other side, and the house is quiet, and there are no buttercups in the window. 41 years is not a thing you get over in one. It is not, I am beginning to think, a thing you get over at all. You just build something new in the space where it was the way a forest grows up over a clearing, not replacing what was lost, but no longer only a wound. I do not hate her. People expect me to, and I understand why. And I have tried some nights to summon it because hatred would be simpler and cleaner and would ask less of me. But what I feel when I think of Rosalind now is not hatred. It is closer to the sorrow you feel looking at a beautiful tree you know is dying at the core, a sadness for the sound thing it could have been, and chose not to be, for all that intelligence and all that grace turned toward the taking instead of the building. She had it in her to have loved me. I believe that. She simply decided a long time ago that another life was owed to her, and she spent mine collecting it. That is not a thing I can hate. It is only a thing I can grieve. Josiah came by the house last Sunday. He brought coffee the way he used to bring it to Meg 30 years ago, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and we did not talk about any of it. We talked about the mill, about a stand of walnut he wanted to buy, about ordinary things, the ordinary good things a father and a son talk about when the hard part is behind them and the work is still ahead. And at some point I looked at the empty windowsill above the sink where the buttercups used to be, and I noticed my son had noticed me looking. He did not say anything about it that Sunday. That is not how Josiah does things any more than it is how I do them. We are men who show a thing before we ever say it, and sometimes never say it at all, and understand each other well enough that the showing is enough. He finished his coffee and he looked at the empty windowsill the way I had been looking at it, and then he set his cup in the sink and told me he had to get back, and he left, and I thought nothing more of it. He came back the following Saturday with a small wooden object in his hands. It was a vase. He had turned it himself on the lathe in the mill, out of a piece of the black cherry, the same log I realized, the beautiful hollow one cut from the sound wood at its edges where the grain ran clean and gold. He had made a vase from the good part of the rotten tree. He set it on the windowsill above the sink in the exact place where the jar had stood for 41 years, and he stepped back and looked at it. And then he looked at me. I could see, in how carefully he had sanded it, in the coat of oil he had rubbed into the grain, that this was not a thing he had thrown together. He had spent his week on it. My son, who was still healing from a surgery that had nearly taken him, had spent his recovering hours turning a vase for his father's empty windowsill and had said nothing about it until it was done. I couldn't leave it empty, he said. It bothered me all week, but I wasn't going to put her flowers back either. So. He shrugged the way he does when he has done something that matters to him and does not want to make a production of it. It's not for anybody who isn't in the room. It's just a nice thing to look at while you drink your coffee. Ma had that part right at least. A kitchen needs something alive in it. She just meant it for the wrong person. I did not trust myself to speak for a moment. I stood in my kitchen and looked at a vase my son had turned from the sound edge of the same log whose rotten heart sat on my shelf, standing where the buttercups used to stand, and I understood that he had taken the very symbol of 41 years of betrayal and made it into something else with his own hands, something that belonged to us and to no one who was not in the room. We'll cut some flowers in the spring, he said. Whatever grows out back. Nothing you have to order from 2 towns over. Just whatever's actually here. Whatever's actually here. I have turned that phrase over many times since. There is a whole philosophy in it, if you want one, the difference between a beauty You have to import at great expense to keep up an appearance and a beauty that simply grows where you already are, that costs nothing and hides nothing, and is exactly what it appears to be. Rosalind's buttercups had been the first kind. Whatever my son and I cut in the spring would be the second. I did not say any of that to him. I just nodded, and I put my hand on his shoulder. The shoulder I had watched grow from a boy's to a man's in that mill blood or no blood, and I left it there a moment longer than I usually would. We drank a second cup of coffee that morning, standing up, neither of us in a hurry to be anywhere. He told me the walnut had come in that stand he had wanted, and that he had started milling it, and that the grain was the best he had seen in years. He asked if I would come look at it, give it the old test, tell him what I thought. And I understood what he was really asking. He was asking me to lay my hands on wood again the way I had my whole life, but this time with him standing beside me, both of us looking neither of us alone with what we found. I told him I would come Monday. He said good. That was all. But I have learned to hear what is underneath a small sentence late, but I have learned it. We stood in the kitchen together, the two of us, and the light came in through the window over the sink and fell on the cherry vase and on my son and on the empty table where all of this had started. And for the first time in over a year, the house did not feel hollow. It felt like a house with two people in it who had looked at the worst thing together and stayed. That is not nothing. I have come to think it may be nearly everything. I am an old man. I know how this ends the way all of us end, and not so many years from now. But the mill will be Josiah's cleanly in writing, every line of it read and understood by both of us. And whatever children he may yet have will sit in the sawdust and sort the offcuts by smell, and someone will teach them to lay a hand on a log and feel for the rot. And I hope, God, I hope that someone also teaches them the other lesson, the one it took me a lifetime to learn. That the hand you use to find the rot in the timber is the same hand you must be willing to lay on the people you love. Not because you expect to find rot there, but because love that is afraid to look is not love yet. It is only fear that has not been tested. That is the whole of what I know. I laid my hand on 10,000 logs and read every one of them true, and I could not read the woman across my own table for 41 years, because I had decided in advance that reading her would be a betrayal. I was wrong. The betrayal was in the not reading, and by the time I understood that I had lost the marriage, but I had just barely, in the last hour, saved the thing that turned out to matter more, which was the truth spoken out loud. Between me and my son, where no one can ever turn it back into a lie. So that is why I am telling you all of this tonight. Not because it is a story with a happy ending. It is not quite. It is a story with an honest one which I have come to believe is the better of the two and the rarer. Let me tell you what I have learned, and then I will let you go. Here is what I learned, for whatever it is worth to a stranger listening in the dark. I learned that love is not the same thing as looking away. For most of my life I had them confused. I thought that to trust someone completely meant to never examine them, that questions were a kind of accusation, that a good man hands over everything and asks to see nothing in return. And I paid for that confusion with almost everything I had. Because the people who mean to take from you are counting on exactly that. They are counting on your belief that love and scrutiny cannot live in the same house. They build their whole quiet work on the certainty that you would rather feel like a loyal fool than risk looking like a suspicious one. So let me ask you the question I had to ask myself too late at 68, with the sawdust settling around me, and the truth finally cut open on the carriage. What in your own life have you decided in advance that you are not allowed to look at? What folder have you signed without reading? because reading it would have meant admitting you were afraid of what it said. We all have one. The name on the account. The story that never quite added up. The small flinch you explained away for years. Love does not ask you to look away from these things. Fear does. And the two of them, from where you are standing, can look almost exactly alike. I am not telling you to trust no one. A life with no trust in it is not a life, it is only a fortress, and I would not wish it on anyone. I am telling you the opposite, really. I am telling you that real trust is not fragile. Real trust can bear to be looked at, to be written down, to be put in plain words, on plain paper, because real trust has nothing to hide from the light. Put the love in writing. Not because you doubt the person across the table, because paper protects what is real from the slow work of what is not, and because a bond that cannot survive being seen clearly was never quite the bond you thought it was. If any of this found you tonight, if you know the particular ache of having trusted the wrong grain, or the harder ache of wondering whether you ever really looked at all, then sit with it a moment before you go, and tell me honestly in the quiet, where only you can hear it. Is it kinder to love someone blindly and be spared what you might find, or to love them with your eyes open and risk everything you might see? I have made my answer. I made it 40 years too late, and it cost me a marriage, and I would still make it again. I only wish I had made it sooner.